gosh, I'm not sure that word's ever been said within these walls before, and not in that context. My wife insists that gay means happy.
I think she's absolutely right. And I intend to be very happy. Very many times in my life.
So if you heard about the story of a prominent politician who sent a hitman after his gay lover, but the inept, nervous would-be assassin, after enacting an overly convoluted plot, only succeeded in shooting his would-be victim's dog, you'd probably think it was the plot of some black comedy, right? Actually, though, not only did it happen, but it's probably a key reason why Margaret Thatcher came to power, changing not only British but world history, as she helped bring to the fore a new economic and political order that emphasized austerity and privatization, and which still dominates much of the English-speaking world to this day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. A Very English Scandal, brought to us by Russell T. Davies of Doctor Who fame, is the perfect example of the cliche that truth is stranger than fiction. In fact, I watched it before I did any research or really knew anything about the events that the miniseries depicts. The miniseries actually doesn't cover all the very strange circumstances and coincidences surrounding this scandal, where the would-be Prime Minister Jeremy Thorpe would go up against and lose his promising career in politics to a former male model, Norman Scott. The miniseries is closely based on a book by the novelist and journalist John Preston with the same title. It's described as a non-fiction novel, but still Preston followed newspaper articles, biographies, interviews, and other sources very closely. As an article published in Radio Times put it, it's telling that Preston didn't get sued. I can't think of a better endorsement for one's research than that. Anyway, like the book, the series starts at the very beginning of Thorpe and Scott's ill-fated relationship, when Thorpe meets Scott working at the horse stables of a wealthy friend. Thorpe quickly falls for the handsome young man, and after coercing him into sex at Thorpe's mother's house of all places, uses a combination of his charismatic and domineering personality and his wealth and power as a member of Parliament to get Scott to join him in London. However, if Thorpe was hoping he had found a starstruck young man who'd accept his largesse and would quietly let himself be put away the day Thorpe got bored with him, he was catastrophically wrong. For starters, Norman Scott was raised Catholic, and so the old Catholic guilt kicked in. Also, it didn't help that Scott suffered from chronic depression, made worse by his inability to find steady work. John Preston argues that Scott found Thorpe to be the demonic figure that haunted his entire life. Even after Norman fled Thorpe's clutches, he was compelled to sometimes tell a story of being sexually exploited by Thorpe to people in power, or even to try to flat out blackmail Thorpe for money or just for a new insurance card. This one-man crusade against Thorpe would come out in bursts, with months and even years in between, as Scott drifted from working as a male model to being a married man with one child to being the kept man of a lonely, middle-aged Welsh woman. On his part, Thorpe became just as obsessed in his own way. After all, if just one person in power in the national media ever took Scott's allegations seriously, all of Thorpe's political aspirations would be over. The fear of being exposed as gay that Norman Scott stoked inspired Thorpe to enter into a marriage with a woman, Marion. And then, with the help of Thorpe's loyal friend, one-time colleague in Parliament, and failed businessman Peter Bessel, it would compel him to give his approval to a doomed scheme to have Norman Scott assassinated. Of course, as the mere existence of the book and the miniseries proves, the plot backfired spectacularly, and only succeeded in doing what Norman Scott alone never could: get people to listen to his story. Thorpe was made the subject of the trial of the century, with Norman Scott as the star witness, which is, if you're a fan of Paddington, could make A Very English Scandal a very difficult experience for you.
So he put the substance on his penis turned me over and made love to me.
However, the British establishment eventually rallied behind Thorpe. Thorpe is able to abandon Basil and make him into a scapegoat, and ultimately Thorpe is exonerated. At least, he's exonerated in a strictly legal sense. In the aftermath, his entire political career, much less his dream of becoming Prime Minister, is nothing but ashes. It's a really bizarre story full of tragic but real people that would have been hard to screw up in the telling. However, for me, what makes a very English scandal so good and so fascinating is that it captures a major turning point in gay history. Time when sodomy was legalized in the UK, but social attitudes were still far from accepting. Both the book and the miniseries link Thorpe and Scott's warped relationship with the movement to legalize sodomy in the United Kingdom. In fact, I would say that the miniseries aims to capture the spirit of this historical moment in the gay rights movement, even more than the book does. The crucial historical backdrop overshadowing this story isn't really just a tale of British parliamentary politics in the 1960s and 1970s. Even more than anything else, it is about how homosexuality was decriminalized in the United Kingdom, and the slow but decisive generational shift this legal change represented. It was both the end of the most overt way in which the government could persecute people who engaged in same-sex romantic relationships, and a sign that same-sex intimacy and love were slowly becoming socially accepted. A law against sodomy had been on the books since the time of Henry VIII, when the government was taking over moral regulations that had once been the responsibility of church authorities. Conviction could lead to execution. However, the law was rarely enforced until around the end of the 17th century. By then, London had become the largest city in Europe, and both the rapidly growing print media and middle-class would-be reformers found public anxieties about what sins could be going on in large anonymous cities like London to be ripe for harvest. Although the old sodomy law covered both bestiality and any kind of anal penetration, regardless of the gender of both partners, men who had sex with men were the target. As a result, the era of the British Enlightenment actually saw far more prosecutions for actively gay and bisexual men than ever. If you get nothing else from listening to my show, just remember that social progress in history doesn't always move in a straight line. Although a majority were not killed, many were put in the pillory and subjected to horrific humiliation at the hands of the general public. Of course, changing attitudes toward crime and punishment meant that by 1861 the pillory and later capital punishment for sodomy were abolished. Still, the evidence needed for a conviction was actually less than what the old sodomy law demanded, and the penalties could still be fairly harsh. Oscar Wilde was famously condemned to 2 years of hard labor, and imprisonments essentially for being gay continued into the Cold War era. Even after a government committee published a report, the Wolfendale Report, in 1957 recommending that homosexuality no longer be considered as a crime or a mental illness, the law remained in effect. That is until 10 years later, when an eccentric Scottish nobleman obsessed with the well-being of badgers, the Earl of Arran, and a Jewish MP from Wales, Leo Apps, both shepherded a bill decriminalizing homosexuality, the Sexual Offences Act, through both houses of Parliament. Both men were absolutely straight. Aaron himself was strongly and personally motivated by his older brother, a gay man who committed suicide when he was blackmailed.
And the deaths go on, by hanging, by poison, by gas, men killing themselves through fear and shame. And I don't think it's suicide. I think it's murder. They are murdered by the laws of the land.
A very English scandal delves into the idea of what it must have been like to be a gay man like Thorpe, caught between the old pre-Sexual Offences Act world, where being actively gay meant love was rare, but the threat of violence, blackmail, and even prison was omnipresent, and a new world just beginning to be born, where gay people could pursue real and public romantic relationships. Thorpe is absolutely no victim, of course. His first sexual encounter with Scott would unquestionably be considered rape today. That's just for starters. However, Russell T. Davies, with his script for A Very English Scandal, along with Hugh Grant's excellent and sincere performance, doesn't try to absolve Thorpe, but instead comprehend him as a creation of a now long-gone era in the history of homosexuality. In fact, the series suggests that, in a rather distorted way, Thorpe loved Norman. He simply was, even with the tides turning toward decriminalization, unable to express his feelings toward Norman in a way that could ever lead to a healthy companionship. I should take a step back and say that nobody, Russell T. Davies or John Preston included, does or can know what Thorpe felt for Norman Scott, and if those feelings at any point were more complex than just lust. This part of the story is largely speculation, but it's the kind of speculation that I think is welcome in any historical adaptation. It lets Russell T. Davies take Preston's already incredible story of desire gone horribly sour and deepen what Preston has to say about the gradual yet profound change in what it meant to be gay in this time. On a more subtle level, Davies also makes the saga of Jeremy Thorpe into a lesson on what kind of people are made when a government tries to control sexual relationships between two consenting adults. Ultimately, rather than helping make a more moral country, it only gives rise to true moral monsters.